In 1 Corinthians 11, the Apostle Paul argues for the practice of head covering while praying and prophesying. While everyone agrees that he's making an argument in favor of the practice, some people are genuinely confused about how that squares with the last verse of the passage. That says, "If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God." Now, this verse was what kept me from embracing head coverings for years. Here's how I used to interpret this passage. I'd say, what Paul is saying is this doctrine can be very contentious, and he doesn't want that. So if you feel upset, just don't practice it because none of the churches make it mandatory anyway. So in this video, I'd like to show you why that interpretation is incorrect. And I'll make the case that this verse is actually an argument in favor of the practice of head covering. So the first thing you should know about this verse is that there's a split in English Bibles on the translation of this passage. I quoted the ESV Bible, which says, "We have no such practice." But other popular translations, such as the NASB, NIV, and HCSB, translate this passage as, "We have no other practice." So it reads, "But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God." So some Bibles say we have no such practice, and others say we have no other practice. That's a pretty big difference. Now, it may surprise you, but no such practice is the right translation. The NASB even footnotes that it's the literal translation, even though they don't use that as its rendering. So now that we know no such practice is the right translation, let me show you why I don't believe it should be interpreted as dismissive of the practice of head covering. Reason number one. While Paul tells the contentious person that they have no such practice, he doesn't here define what that practice is that they don't have. I believe the confusion lies in wrongly assuming that it's head covering. Let me explain. We understand that if I said the phrase, "he doesn't want to go there," you can only know who he is and where there is by looking at the previous passage to find the antecedent of those words. So what we need to know is what is the antecedent of practice in verse 16. That's the key to rightly understanding this passage. When we do this, we'll see it's not the practice of head covering that he's referring to, but the practice of women praying uncovered. Let's start at verse 13 so you can see this for yourself. "Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God." Now, the start of this verse, where he says, "Judge for yourselves," is the start of a new thought. He's giving a new argument from nature, and he does this by asking a rhetorical question. Is it proper for a woman to pray uncovered? This is the question under discussion, women praying uncovered. He then proceeds to make his argument by referring to our hair lengths before arriving at our verse that we've been talking about. So it should be noted that the closest antecedent for practice is not head covering, which hasn't been mentioned since verse 10, but rather the closest antecedent is women praying uncovered from verse 13. That's the only practice being discussed in this section, and that's the one the rest of the churches didn't have. So Paul is actually saying that in all of the churches, none of them have the practice of women praying uncovered. Reason number two. In verse 2, Paul says that head covering is a tradition that was delivered with apostolic authority. He said, "Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions, just as I delivered them to you." Since head covering was a practice that Paul said he delivered to the church for them to hold to, he couldn't have said in verse 16 that it was something that we have no practice of. That would be a contradiction. Reason number 3. Would Paul go through such a lengthy defense to simply leave it up to you in the end? We'd expect little to no defense for an issue that's Christian liberty. Also, we'd expect the created order and angels not to be reasons, as they're too big to overturn. Reason number 4. Paul said in verses 4 and 5 that to not practice head covering would be dishonorable and disgraceful. He also said in verse 6 that if a woman won't cover her head, that she should have her hair cut off. It would then be a contradiction if in the final verse he let you not practice it consequence-free. Reason number 5. To allow someone to not practice a doctrine just because they're being contentious would be overlooking the contentious person's sin. This view would seem like giving into a child if they're throwing a tantrum. If they kick and scream enough, just give them their way. It would be unthinkable that the apostles would allow this. Summary. So in verse 16, the Apostle Paul teaches that in all of the churches, none of them have the custom of women praying uncovered. As a summary, we know this is the case because, number 1, the closest antecedent for the word practice from this passage is women praying uncovered. Number 2, Paul said that head covering was an apostolic tradition that was delivered to the church for them to hold to. So there was a tradition of head covering. Number 3, he went through a lengthy defense in favor of head covering, using big reasons like angels and grounding it in the creation order. Arguments like this are too big to overturn. Number 4, he said to not practice head covering is disgraceful and that women who don't should have their hair cut off. So for Paul, there was a tradition that needed to be upheld. Number 5, it's unthinkable that the apostles would make provision for a contentious person to get their way, rather than calling them to repent. So Paul in this last verse shows that the practice of head covering goes beyond Corinth and is the practice of all churches everywhere. I mean, just think geographically of the churches that were in existence at this time. Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, Ephesus, Iconium, Caesarea, Antioch, and there's many more. And here's the thing, they all practice head covering. All of these churches would have a mixture of Jews and Gentiles worshiping in them, and they're from different cultures. They're spread out geographically over thousands of miles over such modern-day places as Israel, Turkey, and Greece. Yet, they all held to the same Christian doctrine regarding head coverings. I mean, how can you account for such unity except the church understanding head covering is a command for all Christians? So rather than being an argument against the practice of head covering, it's one of the strongest arguments for it. It shows that the early church was unified on this matter, and no matter the place or the culture, they all held to it.